Hi, this is my basing video. I've intended to do one for some time. I'm doing it partly because of a request about colouring tufts a long time ago. And also, although I realise very well that there are a lot of videos out there for basing, and everybody's fondly attached probably to their way of doing it, that who is likely to watch this. Nonetheless, I'd like to recommend some of these techniques to you because of two main aims that I have developed in basing that this method does work to achieve. And the two aims are strength, real solidity of the miniature on the base, and also naturalness of appearance of the additions to the base, of the decoration to look like a piece of nature, really, that the figure is standing on. So without more ado, I'm going to start. Now it's 28mm I'm looking at, and 28mm on these discs that turn up in our pockets in this country, inch across. The techniques are, applicable to plenty of other bases, like these 28mm cavalry bases, and for 15mm and 18mm, whatever, particularly on metal. But it doesn't really matter. I don't do dioramas. I like to do separate figures so that I can move them in relation to each other for skirmish wargaming, but also just because I like that thing of constantly rearranging them and seeing them in different relationships to each other. So I begin with one of these discs, and I always put them face down, which is it means that you've got tiles uppermost and it gives you more detail. There's more detail, more texture on the top surface, and the figures will therefore adhere better to it because they key onto it better. And the way that I key the figures is like this. I do a grid from one side to the other, the length of the base, and then across it. So this is just like cross-hatching in drawing, if you do that. And then diagonally, so that you've got both directions. You've got a kind of Union Jack crisscrossing over the whole thing. Go for any gaps, and then you've got a base that's really will key on to what you've got underneath. Now for strength, somebody might say, well, you should be using 2-part epoxy glue or some other kind of glue. I use Gorilla super glue, which I think is the strongest super glue. I want them to glue pretty quickly. I want them to set pretty quickly, I mean. So there's, I may not be using the strongest glue, but I like it to be reasonably adaptable, reasonably quickly set, and I can then get on with the next stage. So a small amount of glue on the base, not a lot. Carefully place the figure and then let it dry, and you don't need to add pressure because the weight of the figure will do that. Here's one I did earlier, as they say, and the next stage is this. I use, for my main basing material, milliput. I know people get fond of various fillers from for building, work and all sorts of other things, but I favour Milliput. It's cheaper than green stuff. Obviously, I think it would be a waste to use green stuff for this purpose, but Milliput is still very strong. It's a bit more brittle. I hope it's available in the States. It's British made, but it is very strong, and you've basically got a pretty permanent piece of basing there that will strengthen the bond as well for the figure to the base. So next thing I do is roll it in. Oh, incidentally, in mixing it, this was already mixed by me for this, but I always cut it into slivers like this, equal amounts of hardener and the main epoxy, and cut it into slivers, and then roll it out into a snake, double the snake, twist the snake so that it's twisted all down its length, and then double that and compact it so that it's completely compacted again. Squidge it a few times and then roll it out into a snake again, double the snake, twist it. Do that 3 times, squidging it each time in between, and you've really quickly got to mix that way. This is, I do it this way because I've done a lot of forging in the past, and I'm used to mixing materials like this. By the way, I've used Milliput since almost I can remember, and it's a 2-part epoxy, and you know, it's one of many modelling materials that I've used because I used to be a professional sculptor, I do think it's, you know, one of the best materials available, really, for its cost, for these kinds of purposes. And this is how I've picked up a technique that I'm about to show you, is that I've just used vast quantities of it. So another a little snake. I put rather a lot on this time, but run it around the base of the figure itself, and then just squeezing it out so that it goes to the edge of the disc, and then with a knife or a modelling tool, you can just work it over the edge, I do, of the base of the figure, because then you've got that extra strength. It's helping hold the figure onto the base. If you do have if you do drop it in the heat of the moment in battle on the tabletop, even onto the floor, or as I once had a terrible accident when I got rather overheated about a cat crapping on our lawn, and sent a whole box full of figures out the window, dropped 3 floors equivalent because of the basement onto concrete, and only out of the whole box, I think only 2 of the figures' bases broke away from their bases, which was pretty good going. So, and that's it really. You've got the base just overlapped a little bit. Sometimes I actually deliberately, especially when I've got a little bit extra on there, work a little bit of the Milliput onto the top of this base so that you can keep some of the texture consistently. And the great thing about these metal discs that turn up in our pockets in the UK is that they have a little rim on them, and you can run your knife or your modelling tool around the edge and get a perfectly neat edge, and it comes right up to the edge like that and is kind of confined. It's just beautiful. It's just like they're made for it, really. Now, this is an essential technique that I'm showing you next, which is part of the naturalness that I achieve on my bases. Take a knife is best. It doesn't have to be sharp though. And at the moment the milliput is very smooth, as you can see. But I want a kind of irregular cast across it of texture. And I do it with it like this. I take the knife and with it almost perpendicular, or rather at right angles to the surface, the milliput, I scrape it across. A bit too much there. I've loaded this one a little bit too much in my enthusiasm to explain what I'm doing. But not over the whole base, but just over parts of it. I just scrape across, and what you get is a kind of churned up quality. Just a little there. I think that'll do. I don't know how much the camera is going to pick this up, but it gives you a sort of slightly ploughed effect on the surface. Now, you can play that down just by pushing it down with your finger a little, or you can leave it as is. Usually, because variety is part of the liveliness and, you know, what I want to achieve with these things, I do both. I leave some parts of it quite rough, and other parts of it I just slightly subdue. Just last check on the edges, and there we are. And that is my initial basing preparation. This roughness is going to give me later on a kind of a guide for the application of the other materials. So it's an essential part of what I do. That's the first major stage. Obviously the milliput has to dry, so we move on to the next stage. Now here I've got a whole series of figures that have been done earlier, and you can see, I hope the camera's focusing, I've got a bit of a balancing act here, that I've painted as in one of my earlier videos. What was it called? Tiny Tip 3 Basic Colour Relation. That's it, Tiny Tip 3 Basic Colour Relation. And I just talked about how important it was to, very early on, get some green, roughly equivalent to what you're going to end up with, or brown, or whatever you colour your base is, in, so that you get your colour right on your figures. So that's what I've done here. You can see the only other part, apart from the priming and an umber wash, more or less, on these little civilian figures here, is the flesh. Prior to that, they were like this, just primed with an umber wash. And the next thing I would do to these ones would be to apply some colour to the base to give me an idea to go by. I also do the brown of the edging of the base early on, or at least the first coat. Often it gets worn off and I have to do more. So, in other words, we're at this kind of stage now. I've painted the figure, and I've begun applying the tufts on here. Often I do a tuft that's right on the edge, and because they're large and I want to get lots of different textures on my base, I will cut the larger tufts across them or slightly round, and then they'll go right on the edge like that. Now, another thing I've done here is apply PVA glue, white wood glue that is, to little parts of the base. And the parts of the base that I've applied to are the parts that weren't torn up earlier, more or less. They're the lower regions that are rather plain on the base. And then, having applied the glue to those regions, that's how it gives you this naturalness, because it gives you this kind of random effect, having brought the knife across it and it being quite random. I then run the base of the figure, let's actually do this, through this pot. Now I've got lots of pots of different size sands and tiny pebbles that I've picked up on, collected on beaches, that I've just scooped up really, but are graded and all sorts. But actually, mostly I use this one, which is a mix of all of them. It's got a lot of sand in it, which is virtually dust, because you need that really, because relative to the scale of the figure, you don't want whacking great stones all over it. But it has got some larger things which you can actually pick off individually. But if this figure now had the glue on those parts, I would run it right through the middle of this, tap it off, and then let that dry. And this also has, as you can see, has got some static grass in it as well, mixed in it. So this is a whole sort of rich mix in itself in this tub. And that is the mix, as far as I'm concerned. It's quite an essential part of basing for me. And I constantly top this up, especially with very fine, dusty sand, but with all the other bits and bobs too. Another essential ingredient lately to my basing, the appearance, is Vallejo mud. They do various sorts. I mostly use the thick mud acrylic, and it gives you again a very fine and well coloured, good colour, pebbly, mucky kind of application that enriches the base. I don't put it over very much. In fact, this one's got it on more than most. But it's just one of those things that, again, I apply around the milliput, in relation to the milliput, random, torn up, textured surface that I gave it early on. So, I then apply more tufts, as with this one. I'm not going to do all this in front of the camera because it's just going to be rather tedious, I think. But what I prefer generally to do several sorts of tuft. Some of them these days actually are rather beautifully more than one colour at once, like this moss. I favour this very much. And here's another one, wilderness tufts. It's got a little bit of yellowish on the darker green. And I apply things like this stuff. I don't know what this is called, whether it's just called flock or what, but I find I tear tiny little pieces of this off and super glue it and just squidge it down, and it just looks like small ground plants. Very, very useful, very, very nice additional texture. As I say, everything is to do with arriving at varied texture. And then these, which look like leaf, I don't put much in the way of flowers on. I mean, obviously all my figures, nearly all my figures so far, are dark age, so I don't want to, I certainly don't want, and this is an important point, to emphasize the base over the figure, to dominate the figure. It's meant to just reinforce the figure and complement it. So I don't go over the top, and especially I don't want a lot of bright blooms I don't want it to look like some, you know, seaside roundabout or something covered in pansies and fuchsias and all the rest that you do see. Anyway, here is a base that I've applied everything to, really. So, not too much stuff, and not too even. Very important to make it not kind of checkerboard. I put several sorts in close to one another, because that is how plants will tend to grow. You know, they will tend to grow on areas that are more nutrient rich and that suit them, and they will be quite close to each other in that way. And then you might have other areas, and for this you might look at my video which I made earlier on oh god, what was it called? I can't remember. It's something about basing, model basing, that's it, something like that. It's actually a film of a patch of waste ground that I take as a generic kind of model for my bases, and I use it as the basis of my basings. Okay, so having got to this stage, the next thing for me is always, I don't accept anything colour-wise really there much, except I'll let little bits of it poke through. So I now do the colouring of the base with paint, which is what somebody a long time ago asked me to talk about. This is, I mean, please don't stick or feel that I'm saying that it's got to be these colours. Not at all. The whole thing is I'm constantly shifting it and you know, varying it. But this is Vallejo Brown Violet, and I'm going to quickly do a very little bit of red, quite a bit of green. That was flat red. This is medium olive, and I think we'll need a little bit of white. Actually, this is ivory, but that'll do. Whoop! Should have shaken and didn't. Let's find a brush. And so a bit of this, as with my video about complementing complementaries modifying each other. So I wanted to get a much more moderated. I'm going to need a bit more green than that, actually. Grey green rather than this bright emerald that I've started off with. But just to play it down a little bit towards the middle. Here we are. This is about what I want. Perhaps a wee bit more red and white, a little lighter, a little grayer. Okay. And we'll have let's have a so-called green ochre as well. Actually shake it this time. Just a little bit of that. Now, this is what I do. I really heavily, and it's already thinned heavily actually, but I heavily thin the paint and just wash that on there, really, onto there's no great, but the thing is not to douse it, just to touch it on. And with a lot of these materials where you've applied a bit of the brown, so-called brown violet, which is actually a sort of an olive green here, where you've applied sands and things, it often will just sort of seep very quickly across it. And you can see I'm just moderating things, even this ground bit, and just touching the edges. I find that a lot of the tufts are too green, and they're too one colour for my taste. I want them to be more natural, more varied. And especially as most campaigning in the Dark Ages was in loosely the summer months. Obviously there's exceptions for that. We all know about Alfred the Great being taken by surprise on in the middle of the Christmas celebrations, but mostly they campaigned for very good reason in better weather. So that's all I do, just touches, but with very, very watered down paint. Taking it off the edge there. But allowing some of those basing materials and that Vallejo mud still to show through. Now I would go on from here now to vary this a little bit more. I would put other colour paints on, but because I'm clocking up a long time for me now, this is a long video, I'm not going to go into a lot more, but you get the technique, I hope. That's the basic idea, is to just touch these up now. And the rhythm that these plants and these patches of more sort of pebbly or muddy area on the base has all come from that scuffing up with the knife, just running the edge of the knife over the milliput at an angle earlier on. And that has given me, the basis to proceed to find these kind of this kind of layout on the base, really, the shapes of it, and it be that little bit more natural and that little bit more random than I might otherwise have done. It doesn't mean to say that you can't decide, you are still deciding to put this and that where you want them, but it gives you a sort of a ground, basically, a patch of ground that is somewhat naturalistic to work with. And don't be afraid to use your fingertips. I use it all the time in my studio, the other sort of painting, and on this sort of painting. To take paint off, to moderate, and to distribute, and to add a bit of texture as well sometimes because of your fingerprints. Anyway, there you go. As I say, I would put other colours on there at the moment. It's a little bit over-dulled now. And I would add a little bit of dry brushing highlight maybe to some of these things. I don't do a lot of dry brushing because it always gives that sort of dusty appearance, but just a little. But you get the idea, and that is the basis of my my basing. That's how I go about it, and you've got a really strong and natural looking base. So I hope that's useful, and please like and subscribe if you will, and thanks very much for watching. Cheers.